Hi, I'm Jen from Tea Leaves and Tweed, and here I talk about all things tea, so if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, be sure to subscribe to follow more of what I do. This week in the United States, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to our Constitution, which kind of started the legalization of women's suffrage in the United States. It is worth noting that the 19th Amendment primarily gave white women the right to vote, and the work was far from done from there. But August of 1920 was when the final state that was needed ratified the 19th Amendment and made it legal for some women to vote in the United States of America. So in honor of that, I am doing a tea session inspired by the early origins of the US women's suffrage movement. And today we're having tea with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So it is pretty common knowledge that one of the early starts of the women's rights movement in the United States was the Seneca Falls Convention in July of 1848. And earlier in July of 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was invited along with Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, and Marianne McClintock to go to the home of Jane Wright and her husband to have tea, and there they planned the convention. Now it's interesting, if you read Stanton's autobiography, 80 Years and More, she makes a passing mention to this quote-unquote tea party. However, she simply says that they were invited over to Mrs. Wright's house to plan the convention, and it sounds very much like it was a working day, not a ladies' tea party. Interestingly enough, later on in her memoirs, later in the 19th century, she talks about visiting London and a particularly ill-fated tea party that she was invited to, where the tea table was overturned and all of the delicious things went all over the floor. So if I really wanted to recreate a tea party from the autobiography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that would be the one where I would have the full menu. But because of its integral role in the planning of the early women's rights movement, I wanted to look at tea as it might have been drunk in the household of Mrs. Jane Hunt, who was a Quaker woman in upstate New York. And so to that end, I found a cookbook from the early 1800s written by a Quaker woman. The book Domestic Cookery by Elizabeth Lee was considered the Quaker woman's home companion. And so I thought I would look at what she says about the preparing and serving of tea. Now, in her cookbook, she talks about black tea versus green tea. And I talked about this a little bit last week, where they talked about how they actually saw green tea as being more stimulating. And people who had weak nerves should avoid green tea as being overstimulating. And I found this particularly interesting because as the research to actually look at the chemical constituents of tea has improved, we've actually found that some green teas have more caffeine than black teas. However, apart from the science, she does talk about a different steeping method for both green and black teas. Green tea is steeped for 2 to 5 minutes, while black teas are steeped for 10 minutes. So the black teas are supposed to create kind of a richer, more fortifying, less stimulating beverage. And I think that a group of teetotalers, which they were all teetotalers, and the temperance and anti-alcohol movements were very much entwined with women's suffrage. And in fact, tea parties became this women's suffrage thing that they used to promote both temperance and women's rights. I thought that it would be good to use a black tea, particularly because she does give such strong opinions about the steeping times for both green and black tea. I don't think she would be very receptive to Isabella Beeton's idea of mixing green and black tea. So we are going to use a black tea. I'm using my Twinings Prince of Wales, which I use for a lot of 19th century videos, because it is a black tea from a company that was founded in the 18th century, and it is entirely from China, because in 1848, the large-scale production of tea in India had still not become industrially viable, so most of the tea still came from China. And she says to use 1 teaspoon per person. So I have a 2-cup teapot here. 2 spoonfuls of tea. And you use freshly boiled water. And my tea kettle just beeped to tell me that it is boiling. And this is supposed to sit and draw for 10 minutes. So while that steeps, why don't we talk a little bit about the women's suffrage movement? So I talked about how these 5 women, Stanton, Mott, Wright, McClintock, and Hunt, all met to plan the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention was kind of planned in direct response to Stanton and Mott being turned away from an abolitionist convention earlier in the 19th century. There was this idea, particularly among Quaker women, that the ideas of abolitionism, women's rights, and temperance were all kind of intertwined. So even we talk about the 5 women who met, but Jane Hunt's husband, Richard, was also very active in both women's rights and abolitionism, and they were a very politically active family. So it is worth noting that a lot of the early kind of heroes of the women's suffrage movement came from the Quaker community and came from the abolition movement. It's one of the reasons that Frederick Douglass was part of the women's suffrage movement, because suffrage and abolitionism were very tied together, at least in the US. Now that said, just because they were abolitionists didn't mean that they weren't racists. And there has been a fair amount of talk, particularly in recent years, about this idolization, particularly of these white women who fought for women's suffrage, when at the same time, at their marches, tried to segregate the black suffragists that marched with them and were trying to fight for their own cause. And in fact, these black suffragists who didn't really get the right to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified, because it wasn't really until the 1960s that voting rights for Black Americans began to be kind of enforced legally. And even now, there is still a big problem with the disenfranchisement of Black Americans. So it is important to look at history in that critical lens. However, the Seneca Falls Convention is definitely considered one of the origins of the women's suffrage movement, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is definitely set up as kind of one of our founding mothers, if you will. So I found it really interesting how tied into the suffrage movement was tea, and that even going back, reading some of these books I've been reading about the history of tea, the temperance movements in both England and the US drew very strongly on this idea of tea as a social beverage. So one of the reasons I'm focusing on the tea and not the sweets is because I really do feel like these 5 women were not getting together for a tea party. They were not getting together for a social event. This was a working meeting, and they probably had several pots of tea that were being refreshed by servants to keep them energized to plan this meeting. And they were not necessarily sitting around eating finger sandwiches. They were planning their fight. So now our tea has been steeping for about 10 minutes, and the final step to preparing the tea, as Mrs. Lee says, is that you want to take it and stir the pot before you pour it out to make sure that every cup is the same strength of tea. So we'll do that. I think this is probably pretty similar to the idea behind a fairness cup. It's not just for distributing the tea, but also to make sure that the first cups don't get a very strong cup of tea and the last cups get a weaker cup of tea, or vice versa. I am pouring 2 cups of tea. As kind of a recognition that this was a collaborative event, but also because this is a 2-cup teapot and I want to pour out as much of my tea as possible so that the rest of it doesn't get very strong. Oh, it smells so good. This Prince of Wales tea is so forgiving, and I think that's probably part of the reason Twinings was so popular. This is really good. It really could take that 10-minute infusion time. I'm always surprised when these kind of outdated tea preparation styles don't turn out completely horribly. I think that last week was the most striking example of that, because while that was a very strong, very bitter cup of tea, it was not unpleasant, and I even took multiple sips of it. But this is a delightful cup of tea. And they might have added milk and sugar to it. I am not going to today. But I think this is a very representative cup of tea as it might have been drunk in the mid-19th century by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Jane Hunt as they sat and planned the Seneca Falls Convention, which kind of jump-started the women's suffrage movement in the United States. So thank you for joining me for this historical tea session. As always, please comment and let me know what you think, what future historical sessions you are interested in seeing, and just say hi. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you can follow more of what I do. As always, I hope I see you again sometime. Bye.